Now I would like to ask to the front Miha Turšič, who collaborates with Spela Petric, who will be on stage later. And they collaborate with the INTERTWinE project, of which we have George Beckett also in the audience. And Miha is first going to tell us where they are at, what kind of uses they find as artists with supercomputers. And then we'll hear a reaction from George Beckett about that collaboration later. So please give also Miha a hand, and I'm curious about what he has to say.
It's beautiful. So we work with this glass blower.
Can you produce this?
Does it work? I does. Okay. I'm using a prehistorical format to show. It's animated GIF, obviously, since we work in the field of supercomputing and new emerging technologies. Okay, here it is. Yeah, it is. It's very basic image. Yes, with Spela, we started to dig into this, for us, really a field that we are really not, I mean, we really don't come from the field of supercomputing, computing at all. And in these last 2 months, we started to dig into the, let's say, core questions. There's a lot of common preconceptions about supercomputing, and what we are dealing with, it's actually scientific simulations. Not like you were explaining before, artistic simulations, visualizing, and so on. But we really digged into the question of how science is made and how new knowledge is produced. And of course, the first question was, is this science really absolute? Can we really trust the science? And we started to dig into the invisible materiality of supercomputing, what we don't see. Not what is produced on these computers, but we were really curious about the whole process. And one word really popped out from these questions, and it was really that supercomputing, the high-performance computing, is really a consensus between scientists and politicians. Scientists, of course, are using the known knowledge, so what we already know, and are eager to expand it into new knowledge on one side, and politicians who support science and science computation deal with the reduced or the narrow scope of preferred directions, the priorities they are called. So at the end, this high-performance supercomputing is really not totally absolute knowledge, but it's really what it's called provisions allowing to expand the knowledge into the preferred directions. So we are really curious more about mapping the invisible materiality of this supercomputing. And we are finding out, of course, that this technology is not totally neutral, as science should be, but it's really directed by politics. Then, of course, we went into the question of precision of scientific results. We visited a center, it's called the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast, where weeks or months weather forecast is produced. And the question was, are these forecasts really precise? Can we really, I mean, are they really future tellers of the weather? What came out that actually they are using 50 different methods, models of computation, and they are using, we can really say, historical data. I mean, for our case, 3 hours old data, it's history. So it's past, I mean, it's not a current, it's not the present state of the weather. So they are using old data to produce these 50 different precisions. And the question that popped out was, so what's the weather now? Can you tell what's the weather at this moment, at this present moment? And of course, they can tell 50 different answers that are more or less statistically correct, but they don't represent the present moment. And this is something we artists are dealing with. It's trying to present our subjectivity in the present moment. And we came to the conclusion that with this kind of scientific methodology and using this scientific simulations and computation, we can really not get to that subjective precision. But of course, our goal was not really to search only our differences, of course, but we still search for our mutualities. So what do we share? And of course, you were already speaking about the entities. Some entities are biological, some are technological. Spela, she's more familiar with biological entities. I'm more focused on technological ones. And of course, scientific simulation is actually based on simplified or reduced versions of understanding. So there was a case of using, let's say, noise to be more precise, because mathematical algorithms are simplified versions of our reality. And let's say one of these models for the weather prediction is using literally a noise to be more precise, physically more precise. And our question, of course, was, can we produce a technological entity? We are all familiar with the myth of singularity. And the myth of singularity is that technology can go beyond human control. It actually means that we can build technology that is emancipated from our control. We cannot deal with it anymore. These fictions are of artificial intelligence, that it will start to govern us. We won't be able to govern it anymore. But more you go into the research of these, let's say, computational entities, you see that they are just simplifications of being human. So at the end, this, let's say, computational entities cannot emancipate from us because they are just simplified versions of being human. And when we research them, we actually research ourselves, not something that can really emancipate from us. Of course, we digged into this known myth of I mean, there's an understanding that the capital as a phenomena already experienced the singularity when Nixon in early 70s suspended the gold standard, and the whole market became totally fluid of speculation. And today we are experiencing this, let's say, wild use of algorithms on the for the market speculations. And also Marx was using the term of automatisches Subjekt, the Kapital as the automatisches Subjekt, something that is emancipated from us. And this, I mean, if this really goes that far, the capital becomes its own entity, the other entity. It has nothing to do with us anymore. So literally we would have to establish interspecies communication with the capital, and it would not be us anymore. But of course we are critical to this perspective, but it shows, I mean, it shows the light in this aspect of the algorithmic cultures and using the, let's say, more and more advanced computers to produce something else that is not human anymore. So these are the questions that we are dealing at the moment. It's really the question how and why to use these supercomputers and what they really are. We really dig into their materiality. When we visited one of these centers, we really recognized their sounds, the smell. Because some centers are even not accessible, and we were thinking of reproducing the supercomputer only by the sounds and the smell, because they smell differently. Maybe, I mean, the operators of these computers, they actually, I mean, they are dealing with the errors, with the processes of running the algorithms on these machines, and they treat them as the personalities. They project their own personalities, I mean, or psychologies on these computers. And we really research this field. How does it feel to be a computer at the end? But on the other side, we really question this invisible materiality. As I said before, the ideology behind the computers, because you can deal with, I mean, you can develop a computer with the capabilities that are, I mean, as much as you get resources. So you cannot build the ultimate computer yet, because you don't have an ultimate resources.
Maybe it's good to ask George to the front and give a reaction to that. Is that good, Miha?
Thank you. Is this on? Good, you can hear me. So I'm George Beckett. I'm from Edinburgh, and I suspect my job title is probably best explained as a supercomputing consultant. So I'm not actually a scientist. I'm a bit of a meta-scientist. But I think I've been fascinated by the work we've done over the last few months, and I'm particularly impressed by how quickly we've been able to reach some pretty challenging questions around supercomputing. You picked up quite early on in your discussion the issue of absolute precision, and of actually creating or having the perception that a computer will give you an absolute truth. Now, I think it's fair to say that this concept of reducing a natural phenomenon down to something that's idealized has actually always been present in science. So when you conduct an experiment in a lab, you're controlling the environment the experiment runs in. You're growing a life form on a Petri dish, or you're monitoring the chemical mixes you're applying. Do you see the challenge of precision in supercomputing as something more than what scientists have traditionally had to deal with? And is it something that they have to be more, that they have to be fully conscious of if they're going to derive real useful output?
Since we come from art, we really care about this subjective relevance. So what does it has to do with us? I mean, especially this case with the weather predictions. I mean, on one side you see a huge machine producing a huge amount of data, a huge amount of understanding, and at the end you get a very basic information, but we question how is it really relevant to us? What's the value of this final output? And when this final output, for this, let's say, this really basic question, what's the weather at this moment? You see that somehow it's for being a person, it's more relevant what you really experience, not the information you get. You see kind of not really a conflict, but a potential to be more precise. If you include personal or this really subjective perception of the weather into the equation. So can we, let's say, add a social noise, individual noise, subjective noise into the final equation and get more precise information or more valuable information out from the supercomputing process? So it's not really a critique. It's not really a conflict between art and science, but it's this, I mean, we see an opportunity in this mutual or collaborative approach to the whole process. And of course there's this, because all of these machines are so dedicated to so important issues, sometimes you are also using two computers parallel, one just for the backup, because just in case one fails, you can immediately start to use another one. There's always a question, can we use artistic algorithms? I mean, if this, because all these computers use so much power, they're so, everything costs so much. But can we afford doing an art piece on these very precious computers? I mean, this is, let's say, an issue I'm faced usually with using space technology. Satellites are so unique, so precious, that it's really not allowed to use, I mean, and to produce art piece on them. And supercomputers are as well so precious, so valuable, and there's also really a question, can we run something so simple, something so subjective as an art algorithm? This is, I mean, this is where we see, let's say, a contribution or a challenge. Yeah.
So the quest for precision is an ongoing challenge, and in supercomputing, the typical way that is done is by building a bigger computer, by building a faster computer, by building a more capable computer. Do you think this is I get from what you're saying that actually you see that as a very futile way of better doing science, and actually what would be more productive is to step back a little bit from the supercomputer and actually get more of a context of the world you're trying to understand?
Of course, science is usually done in this omni view. So it's kind of a God perspective. And this subjective perspective is totally, it's reduced to minimum, or it's, let's say, ignored. but on the other side, when we observe, for example, these 50 different models of weather prediction, we see that it's not really done in this omni perspective. It's done really in this feminist science critique perspective from multiple subjective perspectives for better final result. So what we research, it's different approach to the science and different approach to use science computation that really allows different scientific approach, not just classical science. So what we digged into this last month also not just to understand the science, but also to understand the critique of science and also to understand different approaches to the science and to test them then into the scientific computational environment.
George and Miha, time-wise, I would like to allow for one more question, otherwise we're going to run off the time scheme. So, Spela, you want to add something? Please go ahead, but that is then we move to Ruth.
Okay, so I would just like to maybe comment. So what is really interesting about HPC high-performance computing is, for me at least, not necessarily only what is done in the scientific context, even though George is basically focused on enabling scientists to perform experiments in this simulation type way, which is sort of gaining more and more popularity. But it's actually how HPC connects to big data and how it connects to deep learning and how it connects to a lot of processes that are running in society that might be a bit invisible to us, but we are actually the end actors involved in these processes. So if in the 20th century we had medicine as this emerging phenomena that used math, that used statistics in a way to actually control or govern populations, now we have this new layer, which is computation and deep learning, and sort of a mystery that comes from within this. It's not only human intelligence that comes up with the connections. So there are kind of maps that are mysterious even to the people that make them, that are created by computers, which I think is kind of interesting also.
Yeah, I think that's a very important challenge that actually those involved in supercomputing and those that are involved in the science that uses supercomputing need to be aware of. We talked about this idea of a scientist as an observer, and traditionally science has been conducted by observing something, formulating a hypothesis about what that mechanism is, and then creating an experiment to test that hypothesis. But with a supercomputer and with technologies such as deep learning and data-intensive applications, in fact, you can step back from that and you can almost speculate on what mechanisms are at play, which is kind of a fundamental breach in the way that these things work. And more importantly, you're not the observer because you're creating a virtual reality. A supercomputer is effectively a virtual experiment. It's just a collection of silicon and copper and fiber optic cables until a scientist creates